Have you ever had one of those moments where someone tries to assert power they absolutely do not possess, threatening you with consequences they have no authority to enact? I'm Marcus Thompson, and what happened to me last summer will make you think twice about assuming you know who you're dealing with. Picture this. A vindictive neighbor calls code enforcement on your perfectly legal shed, smugly threatening you with fines and demolition orders, completely unaware that you're actually the senior code enforcement inspector for the entire county. The look on her face when she realized what she'd done. Absolutely priceless. Let me paint you the full picture of how this beautiful disaster unfolded. I'm a 22-year Army veteran who served 3 tours overseas before settling down in the quiet suburbs of Millfield Creek, a peaceful little community about 40 minutes outside Sacramento. After retiring from the military, I transitioned into civilian work as a code enforcement inspector for Riverside County. It's not glamorous work, but it suits me perfectly. I get to help people understand building regulations, ensure safety, standards are met, and occasionally deal with property disputes. The job requires attention to detail, patience, and a thorough understanding of municipal codes, skills that transferred naturally from my military logistics background. When I bought my modest 2-bedroom ranch house on Maple Street 3 years ago, I was looking forward to the simple pleasures of suburban life. You know the kind: weekend barbecues, maintaining a small garden, maybe building a few projects in my spare time. The house came with a decent-sized backyard, and I had dreams of creating a workshop space where I could pursue woodworking, a hobby I'd picked up during my last deployment. The neighborhood seemed perfect for a guy like me who values privacy and quiet. Most of my neighbors were friendly enough, the kind of people who wave when they see you checking the mail, but don't feel the need to interrogate you about your weekend plans. The house directly to my left belonged to the Hendersons, a retired couple in their 70s who spent most of their time traveling in their RV. They were wonderful neighbors, quiet, respectful, and always quick with a friendly smile. To my right lived the Patels, a young family with 2 elementary school kids who occasionally kicked their soccer ball into my yard. I always tossed it back with a smile, sometimes stopping to chat with their father about his impressive vegetable garden. Behind me was Mrs. Chun, a widow who kept to herself but maintained the most beautiful rose garden I'd ever seen. These people made the neighborhood feel like a real community. Then there was Rebecca Whitman, who lived directly across the street. Rebecca was what you might charitably call a concerned citizen, though most of the neighborhood had less flattering terms for her behavior. She was the self-appointed guardian of property values and neighborhood aesthetics, a woman in her mid-50s who seemed to have made a full-time job out of monitoring everyone else's business. Rebecca had moved to Maple Street about 5 years earlier, following a messy divorce that apparently left her with plenty of time and a burning need to control something in her life. Unfortunately for the rest of us, that something turned out to be the entire neighborhood. From day one, Rebecca made it clear that she took the appearance and conduct of Maple Street very seriously. She had opinions about everything: the color of your mailbox, the height of your grass, the placement of your trash cans, even the types of flowers you planted in your front yard. Most neighbors had learned to simply ignore her passive-aggressive comments and unsolicited advice about property maintenance. She had a particular talent for couching her complaints in fake concern, saying things like, "I'm sure you didn't realize that your lawn edging doesn't quite meet the neighborhood standards," or "I just want to make sure you're aware that some people might find your Christmas decorations a bit excessive." Rebecca's approach to neighborhood management went far beyond casual observations. She was the type of person who measured the exact height of everyone's grass and took photographs of any perceived violations. She maintained detailed notes about delivery schedules, visitor parking, and maintenance activities. I'd heard from other neighbors that she'd actually called code enforcement multiple times over the years, reporting everything from slightly overgrown hedges to improperly stored recycling bins. Most of these complaints were dismissed as frivolous, but Rebecca seemed to view each report as a civic duty rather than harassment. What really set Rebecca apart was her complete conviction that she was always right and that everyone else was simply ignorant of proper standards. She spoke with the authority of someone who believed her opinions carried the weight of law. When she told you that your fence was 2 inches too high or your shed was positioned incorrectly, she didn't present it as a suggestion or observation. She stated these things as indisputable facts, often adding phrases like, according to city regulations, or as clearly specified in the municipal code. The problem was that Rebecca had never actually read these codes, and had no real understanding of what was and wasn't allowed. During my first year on Maple Street, I managed to avoid any significant interactions with Rebecca. I kept my property neat and well-maintained, minded my own business, and generally flew under her radar. I'd see her occasionally during my evening walks around the neighborhood, usually standing in her front yard with her arms crossed, surveying the street like a general inspecting troops. She'd give me a curt nod when our paths crossed, but we rarely exchanged more than basic pleasantries. I preferred it that way, having heard enough stories from other neighbors about her tendency to turn casual conversations into lectures about property standards. The peace couldn't last forever, though. My plans for that workshop space eventually led me to research the possibility of building a storage shed in my backyard. After 22 years of military service, I'd accumulated quite a collection of tools, equipment, and project materials that were currently cluttering my garage. A dedicated storage building would give me space to organize everything properly and free up the garage for my car and workshop activities. I spent several weeks researching different shed designs, considering factors like size, placement, materials, and of course, compliance with local building codes. This is where my professional background became invaluable. As a code enforcement inspector, I had intimate knowledge of every regulation, setback requirement, and permit process in Riverside County. I knew exactly what size structure could be built without requiring a permit, where it could be positioned relative to property lines, what materials were acceptable, and what design features might need special approval. I also understood the inspection process from both sides, what inspectors looked for, and how property owners could ensure compliance from the planning stage. After careful consideration, I decided on a 12 by 16 foot shed that would sit comfortably within the setback requirements, well away from my property lines and positioned to minimize any visual impact on neighboring properties. The structure would be built with standard materials, feature proper foundation anchoring, and include adequate ventilation. Everything about the project was designed to exceed code requirements while remaining within the size limits that exempted it from permit requirements. I even positioned it to be partially screened by existing landscaping, making it as unobtrusive as possible. The construction process took me about 6 weekends to complete, working mostly on Saturday mornings when the weather was cool and the neighborhood was quiet. I'm handy with tools thanks to years of military maintenance work, but I also hired a local contractor friend to help with the foundation and roofing to ensure everything was done properly. The shed was built to last with proper drainage, secure anchoring, and quality materials throughout. When it was finished, I was genuinely proud of the result. A clean, functional building that perfectly met my storage needs, while enhancing rather than detracting from my property's appearance. For about 3 months after completing the shed, life continued peacefully on Maple Street. I organized my tools and equipment, set up a small workbench area, and finally had space to pursue some woodworking projects I'd been planning for years. The neighbors who had seen the construction process were complimentary about the result. Mr. Patel mentioned that it looked very professional, and Mrs. Chun commented that the natural wood stain I'd chosen complemented the existing landscape nicely. Even the Hendersons, when they returned from a month-long RV trip, said they barely noticed the new structure until I specifically pointed it out to them. Rebecca however, had been watching the entire construction process with growing disapproval. Rebecca's disapproval wasn't something she kept to herself for long. I first noticed her increased attention during the second weekend of construction, when I caught her standing at her front window with a pair of binoculars, openly watching me work on the foundation. When I waved in her direction, she quickly stepped back from the window, but the curtain continued to twitch periodically throughout the morning. It was odd behavior, but I chalked it up to natural curiosity about a construction project in the neighborhood. By the third weekend, Rebecca had escalated from passive observation to active surveillance. She began taking what appeared to be deliberate walks past my backyard fence, always carrying a small notebook and occasionally stopping to peer through the gaps in the wooden slats. When I was working on the framing, I noticed her actually measuring the distance from my shed to her property line using a long tape measure, stretching it across the narrow strip of grass that separated our backyards. She was trying to be discreet about it, but subtlety had never been Rebecca's strong suit. The most telling incident occurred during the fourth weekend when I was installing the roof decking. I had taken a break to grab some water from the house when I heard voices in my backyard. Looking out the kitchen window, I saw Rebecca standing just inside my property line, having apparently let herself through the back gate. She was with another woman I didn't recognize, pointing at various aspects of the shed construction and speaking in animated tones. When I stepped outside to address this trespass, both women quickly retreated to Rebecca's yard without acknowledging my presence or offering any explanation for their unauthorized inspection of my property. It was becoming clear that Rebecca had appointed herself as some sort of unofficial building inspector for my project. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was a woman with no knowledge of construction or building codes, attempting to monitor the work of an actual professional code enforcement officer. But I decided to take the high road and ignore her behavior, focusing on completing my project properly rather than engaging in neighborhood drama. My military training had taught me to pick battles carefully, and this didn't seem worth the conflict. After the shed was completed and I had spent several weeks enjoying my new storage space, I began to hope that Rebecca's interest would fade. The structure was finished, it clearly met all applicable standards, and life could return to normal. For a brief period, it seemed like this might actually happen. Rebecca's surveillance activities decreased, and I saw less of her lurking around the property lines with her measuring tape and notebook. Unfortunately, Rebecca was simply gathering intelligence and building her case. What I didn't know at the time was that she had been researching building codes online, making phone calls to various city departments, and consulting with her friend Margaret Kowalski, who lived 2 streets over and shared Rebecca's passion for neighborhood oversight. Margaret had apparently convinced Rebecca that my shed represented a serious code violation that needed to be addressed through official channels. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning in late September, when I found Rebecca standing in my driveway as I was leaving for work. She was holding a manila folder and wearing the sort of determined expression that suggested she had rehearsed this encounter multiple times. I rolled down my car window, assuming she wanted to discuss some minor neighborhood issue like upcoming street cleaning or a community event. "Marcus," she said, her tone carrying a mixture of false concern and barely concealed satisfaction, "I need to talk to you about your little building project back there. I've been doing some research, and I'm afraid there are some serious problems we need to address." I put the car in park and stepped out, curious about what exactly she thought she had discovered. Rebecca opened her folder and pulled out several printed pages, which appeared to be excerpts from municipal building codes that she had downloaded from various city websites. She had highlighted certain passages in yellow and made handwritten notes in the margins, creating what looked like a legal brief prepared by someone with no legal training. According to Section the 15th of April 030 of the Municipal Code, she began, reading directly from her papers, Any structure over 120 square feet requires a building permit. Your shed is clearly larger than that, which means you've constructed an illegal building without proper authorization. She looked up from her documents with the expression of someone who believed she had just delivered a devastating blow. I had to suppress a smile at her confident misinterpretation of the regulations. Rebecca had indeed found a real code section, but she had completely misunderstood its application. The 120 square foot threshold she was citing applied to permanent structures with foundations, electrical connections, or plumbing. My shed wall, larger than 120 square feet, was specifically designed as a detached accessory structure without utilities, which placed it in an entirely different category with different size limits. I appreciate your concern, Rebecca, I replied diplomatically, but I'm confident that the shed complies with all applicable codes. I did quite a bit of research before building it, and I made sure to stay within the permitted parameters. Rebecca's eyes narrowed at what she clearly interpreted as dismissive arrogance. Research? She scoffed. Marcus, I spent weeks studying these regulations. I've talked to people who understand construction law. This isn't some weekend DIY project we're talking about. This is a serious violation of municipal codes that affects property values and neighborhood standards. She pulled out another sheet of paper, this one containing what appeared to be measurements and calculations she had made during her unauthorized visits to my backyard. I've documented the exact dimensions of your structure, and I can prove that it exceeds the allowable size limits. Furthermore, the setback requirements clearly state that accessory buildings must be at least 8 feet from any property line, and I have evidence that your shed violates this requirement. Once again, Rebecca had found real regulations but completely misunderstood their application. The 8-foot setback she was citing applied to structures with utilities or those exceeding certain height limits. My shed was positioned 12 feet from the nearest property line, well within the required setbacks for its category of construction. But explaining these nuances to someone who had already convinced herself of my guilt seemed pointless. Rebecca, I understand you have concerns, I said, trying to keep my tone neutral and professional, but I'm confident that everything was done properly. If you have specific questions about building codes, you might want to contact the County Code Enforcement Office directly rather than trying to interpret the regulations yourself. This suggestion clearly offended her. I don't need to call anyone. Marcus, I've done my homework and I know what I'm talking about. The question is whether you're going to address these violations voluntarily, or whether I'm going to have to file a formal complaint with code enforcement. The threat was delivered with the sort of dramatic flair that suggested Rebecca had been looking forward to this moment. She clearly expected me to panic, perhaps offering to tear down the shed or pay some sort of fine to avoid official scrutiny. Instead, I found myself genuinely curious about how far she was willing to take this misguided crusade. You're certainly free to file whatever complaints you feel are necessary, I told her. That's your right as a property owner. But I'd encourage you to make sure you understand the regulations before making accusations about violations. Rebecca's face flushed red at what she interpreted as condescension. Don't patronize me, Marcus. I've been researching this for weeks, and I know exactly what the law says. Your shed is illegal, period. It's too big, it's too close to the property line, and it was built without permits. Those are facts, not opinions. She gathered up her papers and stuffed them back into the manila folder with sharp, angry movements. I'm giving you 1 week to contact the city and begin the process of bringing your property into compliance. If you haven't taken action by next Tuesday, I'll be filing a formal complaint with code enforcement. And Marcus? She paused for dramatic effect. I won't be backing down on this. I take neighborhood standards very seriously, and I won't allow illegal construction to compromise our property values. With that declaration, Rebecca turned and marched back to her house, leaving me standing in my driveway with a mixture of amusement and disbelief. The irony of the situation was almost too perfect. A woman with no understanding of building codes, threatening to report a code enforcement inspector for imaginary violations. It was like threatening to call the police on a detective or reporting a teacher to the school board for educational malpractice. As I drove to work that morning, I found myself wondering how to handle this situation. My first instinct was to simply ignore Rebecca's threats and let her file whatever complaints she wanted. The Code Enforcement Office would quickly determine that no violations existed and the matter would be closed. But there was something appealing about the idea of letting Rebecca follow through with her threat, allowing her to discover the truth in the most embarrassing way possible. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this could be a valuable teaching moment. Rebecca had spent weeks researching building codes, convinced herself that she understood complex regulations, and was now threatening legal action based on her misinterpretations. She was about to learn that a little knowledge can be a dangerous thing, especially when it's combined with absolute confidence and a lack of practical experience. By the time I reached my office at the county building, I had decided to let events play out naturally. I wouldn't reveal my professional role or try to educate Rebecca about her mistakes. Instead, I would let her file her complaint and discover the truth through official channels. It seemed like the most fitting resolution to her campaign of neighborhood enforcement. The week that followed was relatively quiet, though I noticed Rebecca maintaining her surveillance activities with renewed intensity. She was clearly documenting everything she could about my property, probably building what she imagined was an airtight case for code enforcement. I went about my normal routine, working my regular schedule and enjoying my properly constructed, fully compliant storage shed. True to her word, Rebecca did not back down from her threat. The following Tuesday morning arrived with Rebecca's promised deadline, and she wasted no time making good on her threat. I was drinking my morning coffee and reading the newspaper when I saw her emerge from her house at exactly 8 a.m., dressed in what appeared to be her most official-looking outfit, a navy blue blazer over pressed slacks, carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it had been purchased specifically for this occasion. She walked to her car with the purposeful stride of someone embarking on an important mission, clearly heading to the county offices to file her complaint. What Rebecca didn't know was that I would be arriving at those same county offices about an hour later for my regular workday. As the senior code enforcement inspector for Riverside County, I handled all residential building complaints for our district, which included the entire Millfield Creek area where we both lived. Every complaint filed against properties in my neighborhood would land directly on my desk for investigation and resolution. The irony was absolutely delicious. Rebecca was about to file an official complaint with the very person she was complaining about, and she had no idea. I found myself genuinely curious about how she would present her case to the Code Enforcement Office. Would she arrive with her manila folder full of highlighted printouts? Would she demand immediate action? Would she insist on speaking to a supervisor when the desk clerk tried to explain the complaint process? I finished my coffee and headed to work at my normal time, taking the same route I always took, but with an extra spring in my step. The morning traffic seemed lighter than usual, and even the perpetually broken stoplight on 5th Street cooperated by staying green as I approached. Everything seemed to be aligning for what promised to be a very interesting day at the office. When I arrived at the county building, I could see Rebecca's silver Honda Civic still parked in the visitor section, confirming that she was indeed inside filing her complaint. I used my employee entrance and headed straight to my office on the 2nd floor, settling in at my desk to begin the day's work. I had several routine inspections scheduled for the morning, along with follow-up visits for properties that needed re-inspection after addressing previous violations. Around 10:30 a.m., my desk phone rang. It was Janet Morrison from the front desk, the administrative assistant who handled initial complaint filings and scheduling. Janet had been with the county for 15 years and had seen every type of complaint imaginable, from legitimate safety concerns to petty neighbor disputes over fence heights and flower colors. "Marcus, I've got an interesting situation down here," Janet said, and I could hear the amusement in her voice. "A woman just filed a complaint about a shed in your neighborhood. Says it's a major code violation, built without permits, too close to property lines, the whole 9 yards. She's demanding immediate action and wants to speak to the senior inspector about expediting the case." "Really?" I replied, doing my best to sound professionally interested rather than personally entertained. "What's the address on the complaint?" 1247 Maple Street, Janet confirmed. "The complainant says the property owner is completely uncooperative and refuses to acknowledge the violations. She's got a whole folder of documentation and measurements. Wants us to issue a stop work order and demolition notice." My address. Rebecca had actually done it. She had filed an official complaint against my perfectly legal shed, demanding that the county force me to tear it down. The situation was becoming more surreal by the minute. "I'll take the case," I told Janet, trying to keep any hint of amusement out of my voice. "Schedule it for inspection this afternoon if possible. I want to get out there and assess the situation quickly." "Will do." The complainant left her contact information and said she wants to be notified as soon as we schedule the inspection. She also mentioned something about wanting to be present during the inspection to point out specific violations. Perfect. Rebecca not only wanted to file the complaint, she wanted to personally guide the code enforcement inspector around my property, explaining all the ways my shed violated municipal regulations. She was going to get exactly what she asked for, just not in the way she expected. After hanging up with Janet, I pulled out the official complaint form that Rebecca had filed. Her handwriting was meticulous, filling every available space with detailed accusations and references to code sections she clearly didn't understand. She had attached photocopies of her internet research, hand-drawn diagrams of my property with measurements, and even photographs taken from various angles to document the alleged violations. Reading through Rebecca's complaint was like reviewing a legal brief, written by someone who had learned law from television shows. She cited specific code sections with great authority, but her interpretations were consistently wrong. She claimed my shed exceeded size limits that didn't apply to accessory structures. She argued that setback requirements were violated based on measurements from the wrong reference points. She even suggested that the shed's design violated architectural standards that existed only in homeowners association bylaws, not municipal codes. The most amusing part of her complaint was the section where she described her attempts to resolve the matter directly with the property owner. According to Rebecca's account, she had approached me with legitimate concerns about code compliance, and I had been dismissive and condescending, showing complete disregard for neighborhood standards and municipal regulations. She characterized my suggestion that she contact code enforcement as an attempt to intimidate and discourage proper reporting of violations. Rebecca had painted herself as a concerned citizen trying to protect neighborhood property values while portraying me as an arrogant scofflaw who refused to follow basic building codes. She requested immediate action, including a formal inspection, stop work order, and timeline for bringing the property into compliance. She also asked to be kept informed of all actions taken and wanted to participate in the inspection process to ensure thoroughness. I set the complaint aside and continued with my morning routine, handling several other cases that required attention. Around noon, I called Rebecca's number to schedule the inspection, identifying myself only as Inspector Thompson from Riverside County Code Enforcement. I deliberately used a slightly more formal tone than my usual speaking voice, not attempting to disguise my identity but not drawing attention to it either. "Ms. Whitman, this is Inspector Thompson from the County Code Enforcement Office. I'm calling regarding your complaint about the property at 1247 Maple Street. I'd like to schedule an inspection for this afternoon, if you're available to meet. Me there. Rebecca's excitement was immediately apparent. Oh, thank goodness. I was hoping you'd be able to respond quickly. This is exactly the kind of situation that needs immediate attention. When can you be there? How does 2 p.m. work for you? I asked. I'll need to inspect the property and document any violations I observe. That's perfect. I'll be there at 1:45 to make sure I don't miss you. Inspector Thompson, I want you to know that I've done extensive research on this case. I have documentation, measurements, photographs, everything you'll need to understand the scope of these violations. I appreciate your thoroughness. Ms. Whitman, I'll review your complaint file before arriving, and we can discuss your concerns during the inspection. Excellent. I think you'll find this is a clear-cut case of multiple code violations. The property owner has been completely uncooperative, so I'm glad the county is taking this seriously. After ending the call, I spent my lunch break preparing for what promised to be the most entertaining inspection of my career. I gathered all the relevant code books, measurement tools, and documentation forms, just as I would for any legitimate inspection. I also pulled up the property records for my own address, including the original survey, deed information, and any previous inspection history. The afternoon couldn't arrive fast enough. I found myself checking the clock repeatedly, anticipating Rebecca's reaction when she realized who would be conducting her inspection. Would she recognize me immediately, or would it take a few minutes for the truth to sink in? How would she handle the discovery that the code enforcement inspector she had been demanding to see was the same person she had been threatening and harassing for weeks? At 1:30 p.m., I loaded my inspection equipment into my official county vehicle, a white pickup truck with Riverside County Code Enforcement emblazoned on the doors and equipped with emergency lights for accessing construction sites. I had driven this truck past Rebecca's house hundreds of times over the past 3 years, parking it in my driveway every evening after work. She had seen it countless times but had never made the connection between the county vehicle and her neighbor's profession. As I drove through my own neighborhood toward my own house, I spotted Rebecca already waiting on the sidewalk in front of my property. She had changed from her morning outfit into what appeared to be work clothes, sturdy shoes, khaki pants, and a long-sleeved shirt suitable for walking around construction sites. She was carrying her leather briefcase and had a digital camera hanging around her neck, clearly prepared for a thorough documentation session. Rebecca was pacing slightly, checking her watch and looking up and down the street for signs of the approaching inspector. She had positioned herself for maximum visibility, ensuring that the county official would spot her immediately upon arrival. Her body language suggested nervous energy mixed with anticipation. She was clearly excited about finally getting official validation for her complaints. I pulled up to the curb directly in front of my house and began unloading my inspection equipment from the truck bed. Rebecca immediately started walking toward me, her briefcase in one hand and a welcoming smile on her face. She was clearly eager to make a good first impression on the inspector, who would vindicate her weeks of research and documentation. "Inspector Thompson?" she called out as she approached the truck. I turned around slowly, clipboard in hand and wearing my official county identification badge. Making eye contact for the first time since this whole situation began, Rebecca's welcoming smile froze on her face as recognition dawned. The moment of recognition played out in slow motion across Rebecca's face like a movie scene. Her welcoming smile faltered first, the corners of her mouth dropping as her brain processed what her eyes were seeing. Then came the confusion, a furrowing of her brow as she tried to reconcile the familiar neighbor she had been threatening. For weeks with the official county inspector she had been demanding to see. Finally, the full realization hit her like a physical blow, and I watched her face cycle through disbelief, horror, and what could only be described as existential dread. "You," she whispered, the word barely audible as she stood frozen on the sidewalk. Her briefcase slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers, hitting the concrete with a dull thud that seemed to echo in the suburban quiet. The digital camera around her neck swayed slightly as her body began to tremble with what I could only assume was a mixture of rage and humiliation. I maintained my professional composure, adjusting my county identification badge and checking my clipboard as if this were any other routine inspection. "Good afternoon, Ms. Whitman. I'm Inspector Thompson from Riverside County Code Enforcement. I believe you're here regarding the complaint filed about this property." Rebecca's mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound emerged. She looked like a fish gasping for air, her eyes darting between my face, my official uniform, and the county vehicle parked behind me. I could practically see the gears turning in her head as she tried to process the implications of this revelation. The neighbor she had been lecturing about building codes for weeks was not only a construction professional, but the actual government official responsible for enforcing those codes. "This is impossible," she finally managed to croak, her voice barely above a whisper. "You can't be. I mean, how is this even?" She gestured vaguely at my uniform and truck, as if they might disappear if she waved her hands hard enough. "I understand this might be unexpected," I replied with practiced bureaucratic neutrality, "but I assure you I'm properly credentialed to conduct this inspection. Shall we proceed with examining the structure in question?" The color drained from Rebecca's face as the full scope of her mistake became clear. She had spent weeks researching building codes to challenge someone who enforced those codes for a living. She had threatened to report violations to an office run by the very person she was threatening. She had demanded immediate action from the county against a senior county employee. The irony was so perfect it seemed almost scripted. "I don't understand," Rebecca said, her voice gaining strength as shock gave way to indignation. "How is this legal? How can you inspect your own property? Isn't this a conflict of interest or something?" It was a reasonable question, actually, and one that demonstrated she hadn't completely lost her capacity for logical thinking, despite the circumstances. County policy allows inspectors to handle cases in their residential area, as long as they recuse themselves from any disciplinary actions and have a supervisor review their findings, I explained. "However, since you've filed a formal complaint, I'm required to conduct a thorough inspection, regardless of my personal residence." Rebecca bent down to retrieve her briefcase, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. When she straightened up, I could see she was trying to regain her composure and figure out how to salvage this situation. Her natural combativeness was reasserting itself, pushing through the initial shock and embarrassment. "Well, that doesn't change anything," she declared, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. "The violations are still violations, regardless of who you are. Your shed is still too big, still too close to the property line, and still built without proper permits. Being a county employee doesn't put you above the law." I had to admire her persistence, even in the face of complete humiliation. Rebecca was doubling down on her accusations, apparently hoping that her weeks of research would somehow trump my professional expertise. It was like watching someone insist that 2 + 2 = 5 to a mathematics professor, confident that their internet research had uncovered errors in basic arithmetic. "You're absolutely right that county employees must follow the same codes as everyone else," I agreed. "That's exactly why we need to conduct a proper inspection. Would you like to walk me through your specific concerns?" Rebecca consulted her notes, flipping through pages with shaking hands. Despite everything, she was determined to present her case with the thoroughness she had prepared. I found myself genuinely impressed by her commitment to following through, even after discovering that her target was arguably the least appropriate person in the entire county to threaten with code enforcement action. "The shed is clearly over 120 square feet," she began, reading from her carefully prepared documentation. According to Municipal Code section, the 15th of April 030, any structure exceeding that size requires a building permit. I've measured it myself. It's at least 192 square feet, which puts it well over the legal limit for unpermitted construction. I pulled out my official measuring tape and headed toward the backyard, with Rebecca following close behind. Her documentation was actually quite thorough, I had to admit. She had measured the structure accurately and found the correct code section. Her only mistake was misunderstanding which regulations applied to detached accessory buildings without utilities. "You're correct about the dimensions," I said, stretching my tape measure along the shed's length. 192 square feet is accurate. However, section the 15th of April 030 applies to habitable structures with permanent foundations, electrical connections, or plumbing. Detached accessory buildings fall under section the 18th of December 045, which allows structures up to 200 square feet without permits, provided they meet setback and height requirements. Rebecca's confident expression wavered as I cited specific code sections from memory. She flipped frantically through her printed pages, looking for references to section the 18th of December 045. It wouldn't be there. Of course, because her internet research had only captured the most commonly referenced regulations, not the specialized sections governing accessory structures. "That can't be right," she protested. "I researched this extensively. I spent weeks going through the municipal codes." "I don't doubt your research efforts," I replied diplomatically, "but the municipal code is quite complex, with different sections applying to different types of construction. It takes years of training to understand how all the various regulations interact with each other." I continued my inspection, measuring setback distances and checking the structure's height against applicable limits. Rebecca trailed behind me, occasionally pointing out what she believed were violations while I patiently explained why each concern didn't actually constitute a code violation. Her confidence crumbled a little more with each explanation. "The setback from the property line is 12 feet, I announced after measuring the distance to her fence. "The required setback for this type of structure is 6 feet, so we're well within compliance." "But I measured 8 feet, Rebecca insisted, consulting her notes again. "You measured from the wrong reference point," I explained, showing her the difference between the property line and the fence line. "Setbacks are measured from the actual surveyed property boundary, not from existing fences or landscaping features." By this point, Rebecca's initial shock had transformed into a mixture of embarrassment and stubborn denial. She continued to argue each point, but her voice lacked conviction. It was becoming clear that every single one of her carefully documented violations was based on misunderstandings or incorrect measurements. The final blow came when I examined the structure's foundation and anchoring system. Rebecca had claimed the shed was improperly constructed and potentially unsafe, but my inspection revealed that it exceeded code requirements in every category. The foundation was properly graded and drained. The anchoring system was rated for severe weather conditions, and the overall construction quality was notably high. "I have to say, this is actually exceptional work," I commented, making notes on my inspection form. "Whoever built this really knew what they were doing. The construction quality exceeds minimum code requirements in every category one can assess." Rebecca's face flushed red at what she interpreted as mockery. "Are you seriously going to stand there and tell me that your own shed passes inspection? How convenient that the inspector finds his own work acceptable." "Ms. Whitman, I understand. You're frustrated, but the facts are the facts. This structure complies with all applicable codes. There are no violations to cite." I completed my inspection checklist, documenting measurements, construction details, and code compliance for each relevant section. The shed passed every test with room to spare, just as I had designed it to do. Rebecca watched me work with growing desperation, clearly hoping I would discover some violation that would vindicate her weeks of effort. What about the architectural standards? She demanded, grasping for any remaining argument. The design doesn't match the neighborhood aesthetic. There have to be rules about that. Architectural standards are typically governed by homeowners associations or covenant communities, I explained. This neighborhood doesn't have an HOA, so there are no enforceable design requirements beyond basic safety and structural codes. With that final explanation, Rebecca's last argument evaporated. She stood in my backyard, surrounded by the evidence of her complete misunderstanding of the situation, holding a briefcase full of irrelevant research and facing the humiliating reality that she had threatened a code enforcement inspector with code enforcement action over a perfectly legal structure. The silence stretched between us as I finished my paperwork and prepared to deliver my official findings. The silence that followed my final explanation was thick with tension and Rebecca's growing realization of just how badly she had miscalculated this entire situation. I could see her mind racing, trying to find some way to salvage her position or discover an angle she hadn't considered. Her eyes darted between my clipboard, my official county badge, and the shed that had started this whole confrontation. The weight of her mistake was clearly settling in, but Rebecca Whitman was not someone who admitted defeat easily. "This is ridiculous," she finally declared, her voice taking on a shrill quality that suggested panic was setting in beneath her indignation. "You can't possibly be objective about inspecting your own property. There has to be someone else who can review this case. I want to speak to your supervisor." I had been wondering when she would make this demand. It was a logical next step for someone who couldn't accept that their fundamental assumptions had been wrong from the beginning. Rebecca was grasping for any authority figure who might override my findings and validate her weeks of research and preparation. "That's certainly you're right," I replied, maintaining my professional tone. "County policy requires that any inspection involving an employee's personal property be reviewed by a supervising inspector regardless of the findings. I'll be submitting my report to Deputy Director Sarah Martinez, who oversees all residential code enforcement for the county." Rebecca's eyes lit up at this information, clearly seeing it as her path to vindication. "Good. I want to file an additional complaint about this obvious conflict of interest. How can the county allow an inspector to investigate complaints against his own property? It's completely inappropriate." What Rebecca didn't know was that Sarah Martinez and I had worked together for over 8 years. Sarah was a thorough, no-nonsense professional who had personally trained me when I first joined the department. She was also someone who had absolutely no patience for frivolous complaints or people who wasted county resources pursuing personal vendettas. If Rebecca thought Sarah would be more sympathetic to her cause, she was in for another unpleasant surprise. "The deputy director will be conducting her review based on documentation and evidence, just as I have," I explained. "She'll examine the measurements, code references, and construction details to determine whether any violations exist. Personal relationships don't factor into code compliance assessments." I could see Rebecca processing this information, trying to determine whether demanding a supervisor review was actually in her best interest. Her natural instinct was to escalate any conflict to the highest possible level, but some part of her seemed to recognize that bringing more official attention to this situation might not work out the way she hoped. "I still don't understand how this happened," she said, shifting tactics from demands to what sounded like genuine bewilderment. "You never told me you worked for the county. When I was trying to discuss the code violations with you, you never mentioned that you were a code enforcement inspector." This was true, of course. During our previous interactions, I had identified myself simply as Marcus Thompson, property owner and neighbor. I had never claimed any special expertise in building codes or revealed my professional background. But Rebecca seemed to be suggesting that I had somehow deceived her by not volunteering information about my job. Ms. Whitman, you never asked about my profession, I pointed out. During our conversation last week, you told me that you had researched building codes and identified violations. You threatened to file a complaint with code enforcement if I didn't comply with your demands. At no point did you ask whether I had any relevant professional experience or suggest that we discuss the actual code requirements. Rebecca's face reddened as she recalled that conversation. She had been so confident in her research and so eager to demonstrate her authority that she had never considered the possibility that I might know more about building codes than she did. Her approach had been to lecture and threaten rather than to discuss or inquire. But you should have told me, she insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. You let me go ahead and file this complaint when you knew it was wrong. You could have saved everyone time and effort by just explaining that you were a county inspector. I found this line of reasoning particularly fascinating. Rebecca was now arguing that I should have prevented her from filing a false complaint by revealing information that would have undermined her position. She seemed to believe that I had an obligation to protect her from the consequences of her own actions and assumptions. Ms. Whitman, you were very clear that you had done extensive research and were confident about your conclusions, I reminded her. You told me that the violations were facts, not opinions, and that you wouldn't be backing down. You specifically said that you didn't need to call anyone because you knew what you were talking about. It seemed like you had already made up your mind about pursuing official action. This summary of her previous statements hit home. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably, clearly remembering the absolute certainty with which she had threatened me just a week earlier. Her confident declarations about knowing the law and refusing to back down now sounded foolish in light of her complete misunderstanding of the actual regulations. I was trying to resolve this neighbor to neighbor before involving the authorities, she said, attempting to reframe her threats as reasonable attempts at diplomacy. I gave you the opportunity to address the violations voluntarily. That's more than most people would do. The revisionist history was remarkable. Rebecca was now characterizing her ultimatums and threats as generous offers to resolve the matter amicably. She was conveniently forgetting her condescending tone, her refusal to consider that she might be wrong, and her explicit threats about filing complaints and forcing demolition. I appreciate that you believed you were trying to resolve a legitimate concern, I said diplomatically. However, filing false complaints with county offices does waste resources and can expose complainants to potential liability if the complaints are determined to be frivolous or malicious. The word liability got Rebecca's immediate attention. Her eyes widened as she considered the possibility that her actions might have legal consequences beyond simple embarrassment. She clearly hadn't considered that filing false or frivolous complaints might subject her to penalties or legal action. What kind of liability? She asked, her voice suddenly much quieter and more cautious. The county code allows for recovery of investigation costs when complaints are determined to be malicious or deliberately false, I explained. There are also potential charges for filing false reports or harassment if a pattern of frivolous complaints can be established. However, that's not my area of expertise. Those determinations would be made by the county attorney's office. Rebecca's face went pale at this information. She was clearly imagining herself facing legal bills or criminal charges for what she had convinced herself was civic-minded neighborhood advocacy. The possibility that her crusade for property standards might result in personal legal trouble had obviously never occurred to her. I wasn't trying to file a false report, she protested. I genuinely believed there were violations. I spent weeks researching the codes. I took measurements. I documented everything carefully. I don't doubt that you believed your complaint was valid, I assured her. Intent matters in determining whether reports are malicious or simply mistaken. The fact that you did research and attempted to document your concerns would likely be considered evidence of good faith, even though your conclusions were incorrect. This seemed to provide some relief, though Rebecca still looked deeply shaken by the entire situation. The confident neighborhood enforcer who had threatened me with official action was rapidly being replaced by someone who was beginning to understand that she was in over her head. "So what happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you file your report saying there are no violations, and that's the end of it?" "I'll complete my inspection report, documenting my findings, and submit it to the deputy director for review," I explained. "She'll examine the documentation and either approve my conclusions or request additional investigation. Assuming she agrees with my assessment, the case will be closed with no violations found." Rebecca nodded slowly, clearly processing the implications. Her week-long deadline for voluntary compliance would expire without any action required. Her threats of fines and demolition orders would prove to be completely empty. Her confident predictions about county enforcement would be revealed as the fantasy of someone who didn't understand how code enforcement actually worked. "And my complaint?" she asked. "Does it stay on file somewhere? Will this affect my ability to file future complaints if I find actual violations in the neighborhood?" This was actually a thoughtful question, suggesting that Rebecca was beginning to consider the broader implications of this incident. She was clearly concerned about her credibility with county offices and her ability to be taken seriously in future situations. "The complaint file remains part of the permanent record," I told her. "However, mistaken complaints don't disqualify residents from filing future reports if they observe genuine violations. The county encourages residents to report potential code violations, even if some reports turn out to be unfounded." I could see Rebecca wrestling with the reality that her carefully planned campaign had not only failed completely, but had made her look foolish to county officials. She had wanted to demonstrate her knowledge of building codes and her commitment to neighborhood standards. Instead, she had proven that she didn't understand basic regulations and had wasted government resources pursuing imaginary violations. The afternoon sun was beating down on us as we stood in my backyard, and I could see that the full weight of the situation was finally settling on Rebecca's shoulders. The afternoon heat was becoming oppressive as Rebecca and I stood in uncomfortable silence, the reality of her situation sinking in with each passing moment. I could see her mind working frantically, searching for some way to minimize the damage to her reputation and credibility. The confident woman who had marched to the county offices that morning with her briefcase full of evidence was now faced with the humiliating truth that she had fundamentally misunderstood everything about building codes, property regulations, and the very person she had been threatening. Rebecca's eyes kept darting toward the neighboring houses, and I could tell she was becoming acutely aware that this conversation was taking place in full view of anyone who might be looking out their windows. Mrs. Chun was visible in her garden, tending to her roses but clearly aware of the official county vehicle parked in front of my house. The Patel children were playing in their backyard, their voices carrying over the fence as they kicked their soccer ball around. Even the Hendersons had returned from their latest RV trip and were unloading groceries from their car, occasionally glancing in our direction. "How long have you been working for the county?" Rebecca asked suddenly, as if this information might somehow change the fundamental facts of the situation. "Just over 8 years, I replied. "I started in code enforcement shortly after retiring from the military. It was a natural transition, similar attention to detail, understanding of regulations and procedures, working with the public to ensure compliance with safety standards." The mention of my military background seemed to deepen Rebecca's discomfort. She was clearly beginning to understand that she hadn't just threatened any random neighbor. She had gone after someone with decades of experience in following rules, understanding complex regulations, and dealing with bureaucratic processes. Her assumption that I was simply an uninformed homeowner who didn't understand building codes was proving to be spectacularly wrong. 8 years, she repeated quietly, as if trying to process the implications. And you've been living here for 3 years. So when I was explaining building codes to you last week, you were explaining building codes to someone who enforces them professionally. Yes, I confirmed. But I understood that you were trying to be helpful. Sometimes residents research regulations when they have concerns about neighborhood properties. Rebecca's face flushed deep red at this diplomatic phrasing. We both knew she hadn't been trying to be helpful. She had been trying to intimidate and control. Her threats about fines and demolition orders weren't neighborly suggestions. They were attempts to use official authority she didn't possess to force compliance with standards she didn't understand. I feel like an idiot, she admitted quietly, her voice barely audible above the distant sounds of neighborhood activity. It was the first genuinely honest thing Rebecca had said since this whole situation began. Her usual combative posture had deflated, replaced by the slumped shoulders and downcast eyes of someone who had just realized the full extent of their mistake. I found myself feeling genuinely sympathetic, despite the weeks of harassment and threats. These regulations can be confusing, I offered diplomatically. That's why we have professional staff to interpret them. The codes are written for people with specific training and experience. They're not really designed for casual research by property owners. Rebecca looked up at me with something that might have been gratitude for not rubbing salt in her wounds. But I was so confident, she said, shaking her head in disbelief. I spent weeks reading through those codes. I measured everything. I was absolutely certain that your shed violated multiple regulations. Confidence isn't the same as expertise, I explained gently. The building code is thousands of pages long, with dozens of different sections that apply to different situations. Even experienced professionals sometimes need to research specific applications or consult with colleagues about unusual circumstances. Could see Rebecca processing this information, perhaps beginning to understand why county governments employed trained inspectors rather than simply posting building codes online and expecting property owners to figure everything out for themselves. Her weeks of internet research had given her just enough knowledge to be dangerous, enough to find code sections and make measurements, but not enough to understand which regulations applied to which situations. What are people going to think? Rebecca asked suddenly, glancing again toward the neighboring houses. Everyone's going to know that I filed a complaint against a county inspector over a perfectly legal shed. I'm going to be the laughingstock of the neighborhood. This concern seemed to be weighing heavily on her mind. Rebecca had positioned herself as the neighborhood's unofficial guardian of property standards, the person who understood regulations and held everyone else accountable for maintaining appropriate appearances. Learning that she had been completely wrong about basic building codes would undermine that self-appointed authority permanently. Most of your neighbors probably don't know the details of what happened, I pointed out. They might have seen the county truck, but official vehicles visit neighborhoods for all sorts of routine reasons: inspections, follow-ups, permit verifications. Unless you choose to discuss this situation, most people will probably assume it was just routine county business. Rebecca seemed to find some comfort in this possibility, though I suspected she was overestimating how much attention her neighbors actually paid to her activities. Most people were too busy with their own lives to obsess over property code enforcement the way Rebecca did. But some people will know, she said. Margaret Kowalski helped me research some of the code sections. I told her I was filing a complaint. I was so confident that I would be vindicated that I might have mentioned it to other neighbors too. Margaret Kowalski, the friend from 2 streets over who had apparently encouraged Rebecca's crusade. I wondered if Margaret had actually provided useful research assistance or had simply validated Rebecca's existing conclusions. Either way, Rebecca would now have to explain to her supporters that her case had completely collapsed. People make mistakes, I said. Most reasonable neighbors would understand that you were trying to do what you thought was right, even if you were mistaken about the specific regulations. Rebecca nodded absently, but I could see she was still worried about the social implications of this debacle. Her identity as the neighborhood's code enforcement expert had been thoroughly shattered, and she was probably wondering how to rebuild her credibility and relationships with people who had seen her as an authority on these matters. "I owe you an apology," she said suddenly, looking directly at me for the first time since recognizing who I was. "Not just for being wrong about the codes, but for the way I approached this whole situation. I was condescending and threatening. I treated you like you were ignorant and irresponsible when you were actually more qualified than I could have imagined." The apology seemed genuine, though I suspected it was motivated as much by embarrassment as by actual remorse. Rebecca was clearly hoping that acknowledging her mistakes might somehow minimize the damage to her reputation and relationship with the neighborhood. "I appreciate that," I replied. "These situations can get heated when people feel strongly about property standards. What matters now is that we understand the actual facts and can move forward appropriately." Rebecca nodded, though she still looked deeply uncomfortable with the entire situation. "Is there anything I need to do now? Any paperwork? Or follow up with the county? I don't really know how this process works." "The county will send you a formal notification when the case is closed," I explained. "You'll receive a copy of the inspection report and the final determination. Since no violations were found, there won't be any further action required from either the property owner or the complainant." "And this goes in some kind of permanent file?" she asked, clearly concerned about having a record of filing a false complaint. "The complaint and inspection records are maintained for administrative purposes," I confirmed. "But as I mentioned, filing mistaken complaints doesn't create problems for residents who are acting in good faith. The county understands that not everyone has expertise in code interpretation." Rebecca seemed somewhat reassured by this, though I could tell she was still processing the full implications of what had happened. Her carefully planned campaign to force me to tear down my shed had not only failed spectacularly, but had revealed her complete lack of understanding about the very codes she claimed to be enforcing. "I suppose there's no point in asking you to keep this quiet," she said with a weak attempt at humor. "Although I have to say, you've been remarkably professional about the whole thing. If our positions were reversed, I'm not sure I would have handled it as graciously." This admission suggested that Rebecca was beginning to understand not just that she had been wrong about the building codes, but that her approach to the entire conflict had been inappropriate from the beginning. Her threats and ultimatums now seemed particularly foolish in light of her complete misunderstanding of the situation. "Part of working in code enforcement is dealing with people who are frustrated or confused about regulations," I explained. "Most complaints come from residents who are genuinely concerned about something, even when their concerns turn out to be unfounded." The sun was beginning to lower in the sky, and I could see that Rebecca was eager to escape this increasingly uncomfortable situation. She had accomplished the exact opposite of what she had set out to do, and continuing to stand in my backyard discussing her mistakes was clearly not helping her emotional state. "I should probably let you finish your inspection report," she said, gathering up her briefcase and camera with movements that suggested she couldn't wait to get away from the scene of her humiliation. As Rebecca gathered her belongings and prepared to retreat to the safety of her own house, I could see that the full weight of her situation was beginning to crystallize in her mind. The embarrassment was one thing, but she was also starting to realize that this incident would fundamentally change her relationship with the entire neighborhood. Her self-appointed role as the guardian of property standards had been not just undermined but completely destroyed by her spectacular misunderstanding of the very codes she claimed to enforce. "Marcus," she said, pausing halfway across my backyard, "I know this is probably too much to ask, but is there any way we could handle this quietly? I mean, obviously you have to file your report with the county, but maybe we don't need to make this a big neighborhood issue." The request was understandable, though somewhat ironic coming from someone who had been perfectly willing to make my alleged violations a public spectacle just a week earlier. Rebecca had clearly envisioned herself triumphantly vindicated at some future neighborhood gathering, casually mentioning how she had successfully forced the correction of major code violations through her diligent research and persistence. Now, she was hoping to minimize the visibility of her complete failure. "The county records are public information," I explained, "but I'm not in the habit of discussing my work cases with neighbors unless there's a professional reason to do so. What you choose to tell people about this situation is entirely up to you." Rebecca nodded gratefully, though I could see she was still wrestling with how to explain this debacle to the people she had already involved in her campaign. Margaret Kowalski would want to know what happened with the complaint they had researched together. Other neighbors who had heard Rebecca's confident predictions about county enforcement would eventually notice that no action had been taken against my property. After Rebecca finally disappeared into her house, one spent a few more minutes completing MY inspection documentation. The irony of writing an official report about my own perfectly compliant shed was not lost on me, but county procedures required thorough documentation regardless of the circumstances. I photographed the structure from multiple angles, recorded precise measurements of all critical dimensions, and noted specific code sections that applied to each aspect of the construction. The inspection report would become part of the permanent county files, a bureaucratic monument to Rebecca's misunderstanding of building regulations. Future code enforcement staff who reviewed the case would see that a complaint had been filed, investigated thoroughly, and determined to be completely without merit. They would also see that the complainant had misinterpreted multiple code sections and made measurement errors in her documentation. As I packed up my equipment and prepared to return to the county office, I found myself reflecting on the broader implications of this incident. Rebecca's mistake hadn't been simply misreading a regulation or making a measurement error. She had fundamentally misunderstood how building codes worked and had proceeded with absolute confidence despite her ignorance. It was a perfect example of the Dunning-Kruger effect, where people with limited knowledge in a domain overestimate their own competence in that domain. The drive back to the county office gave me time to consider how to present this situation to my supervisor, Deputy Director Sarah Martinez. Sarah would need to review my inspection findings and approve the case closure, but she would also be interested in the unusual circumstances that had led to this complaint. It wasn't every day that a code enforcement inspector received official complaints about his own property, and Sarah would want to ensure that proper procedures had been followed. When I arrived at the county building, I went straight to Sarah's office to brief her on the situation before submitting my formal report. Sarah had been in code enforcement for over 15 years and had seen every conceivable type of property dispute, neighbor conflict, and frivolous complaint. She prided herself on being able to assess situations quickly and determine appropriate responses. "So let me understand this correctly," Sarah said after I explained the basic facts. "A neighbor filed a complaint about your shed, demanding immediate enforcement action, without realizing that you work for this office." "That's exactly what happened," I confirmed. "She spent weeks researching building codes, measured my property multiple times, and filed a detailed complaint citing specific code sections. She just didn't understand which regulations actually applied to detached accessory structures." Sarah shook her head in amazement. "Did she recognize you when you showed up for the inspection?" "Eventually." It took her a few seconds to process what she was seeing, but the recognition was dramatic. "I can imagine," Sarah said with a slight smile. "What's your assessment of the complaint? Frivolous? Malicious? Honest mistake?" This was an important question because it would determine how the county handled both the case closure and any potential follow-up actions. Complaints determined to be malicious or deliberately false could result in penalties for the complainant, while honest mistakes were simply closed with no further action. "I think it was an honest mistake," I replied. She clearly put significant effort into researching what she believed were the relevant codes. Her measurements were accurate, and her documentation was thorough. She just didn't understand which regulations applied to this type of structure. It seems like a case of insufficient knowledge rather than malicious intent. Sarah nodded approvingly. That's probably the right call. People get confused about building codes all the time, and we'd rather have residents report potential violations than ignore them entirely, even when they're wrong. We discussed the procedural aspects of handling a complaint involving a department employee. Sarah would conduct an independent review of my inspection findings, including verification of all measurements and code interpretations. She would also examine the construction details to ensure that my assessment of compliance was accurate and unbiased. The county's conflict of interest policies required this level of oversight whenever employees were involved in cases affecting their personal interests. I'll have the final report ready by tomorrow afternoon, Sarah said. Assuming your findings are correct, and I have no reason to doubt they are, we'll close this case with no violations found. The complainant will receive notification that the matter has been resolved. After leaving Sarah's office, I returned to my desk to complete the formal inspection report. The documentation process was exactly the same as it would be for any other property inspection, with detailed measurements, code references, and compliance assessments for each relevant regulation. The only unusual aspect was that I was documenting the complete compliance of my own construction project. As I worked on the report, I found myself thinking about Rebecca's situation and how she would handle the aftermath of this incident. Her entire approach to neighborhood relations had been built around her supposed expertise in property standards and building codes. Learning that she had been completely wrong about basic regulations would force her to fundamentally reconsider her role in the community. The phone on my desk rang, interrupting my thoughts about Rebecca's predicament. It was Janet from the front desk, calling to let me know that the complainant in the Maple Street case had called asking for an update on the inspection status. She seemed pretty anxious, Janet reported. Wanted to know when she could expect to hear about the results and whether any violations had been found. Should I tell her the case is still under review? That's fine, I replied. Let her know that the inspection has been completed and the report is being prepared. She'll receive official notification when the case is closed. Rebecca's call to the county office suggested that she was having trouble accepting the reality of the situation. Despite witnessing my inspection and hearing my explanations about code compliance, she apparently still harbored some hope that a supervisor's review might vindicate her original complaints. It was a natural response, I supposed, after investing weeks of effort in researching violations and filing complaints. It would be difficult to accept that the entire effort had been pointless. The remainder of my workday passed quickly as I completed the inspection report and handled several other routine cases. By the time I left the office that evening, Rebecca's complaint had been fully documented and was ready for Sarah's supervisory review. The case would likely be closed within 24 hours, bringing an official end to what had been one of the most ironic situations in my professional career. Driving home through my own neighborhood felt slightly surreal after spending the afternoon officially inspecting my own property. The county truck that had seemed so out of place parked in front of my house that morning now felt perfectly normal as I pulled into my driveway and prepared to spend a quiet evening in my perfectly legal, fully compliant home. As I walked past my shed on the way to the back door, I couldn't help but smile at the structure that had caused so much unnecessary drama. Tomorrow, Rebecca would receive official notification that her weeks of research and her confident predictions about county enforcement had been completely wrong. The shed would remain exactly where it was, continuing to provide the storage space I had designed it for. Blissfully unaware of the bureaucratic storm it had inadvertently generated, the quiet suburban evening felt particularly peaceful after the day's revelations and Confrontations. The next morning arrived with an unusual sense of anticipation as I prepared for what would likely be the final chapter of Rebecca's misguided enforcement campaign. I had submitted my inspection report to Sarah Martinez the previous evening, and I knew she would conduct her supervisory review first thing in the morning. By afternoon, Rebecca would receive the official county notification that her complaint had been investigated and dismissed, bringing a formal end to her weeks of research and threats. During my morning coffee routine, I found myself observing Rebecca's house from my kitchen window. Her silver Honda was still in the driveway, suggesting she hadn't yet made another trip to the county offices to demand updates or file additional complaints. The curtains in her front windows remained drawn, which was unusual for someone who typically maintained constant surveillance of neighborhood activities. It seemed that yesterday's revelations had prompted Rebecca to adopt a lower profile, at least temporarily. The drive to work felt routine, but I found myself looking forward to Sarah's review of the case. While I was confident in my inspection findings, having an independent supervisor verify my conclusions would eliminate any possible questions about bias or conflict of interest. Sarah's 15 years of experience in code enforcement had given her an encyclopedic knowledge of building regulations, and her reputation for thoroughness was legendary throughout the county. When I arrived at the office, Sarah was already at her desk reviewing my inspection report alongside copies of Rebecca's original complaint documentation. She had spread the materials across her entire workspace, comparing my measurements with Rebecca's, cross-referencing code sections, and examining the photographs from multiple angles. Her attention to detail was exactly what this situation required. "Good morning, Marcus," Sarah said as I stopped by her office. "I've been reviewing your Maple Street case. Interesting situation, to say the least. What's your assessment?" I asked, genuinely curious about her independent evaluation of both the complaint and my response to it. "Your inspection findings are spot on," Sarah replied, tapping her pen against Rebecca's complaint form. The complainant clearly put considerable effort into her research, but she misunderstood fundamental aspects of how the building code applies to accessory structures. Every single violation she cited is based on incorrect interpretation of the regulations. Sarah pulled out a calculator and began verifying some of Rebecca's measurements against the code requirements. She measured the structure accurately, 192 square feet, just as you documented. But she applied the wrong size limits. Section the 15th of April 030, which she cited, governs habitable structures with utilities. Your shed falls under Section the 18th of December 045, which allows up to 200 square feet for detached accessory buildings without permits. "That's exactly what I explained to her during the inspection," I confirmed. She seemed genuinely surprised that different types of structures have different regulatory frameworks. "Most people don't realize how complex the building code actually is," Sarah observed. "They find one section that seems relevant and assume it applies universally. It takes years of training to understand how all the different provisions interact with each other." Sarah continued her review, examining Rebecca's setback measurements and comparing them with the actual property survey. Her measurement methodology was flawed too. She measured from the fence line rather than the actual property boundary, which gave her incorrect setback distances. Even if the regulations she cited were applicable, which they're not, the structure would still be in compliance. This level of detailed analysis was exactly what county procedures required for cases involving employee conflicts of interest. Sarah was documenting not just that my conclusions were correct, but that Rebecca's complaints were fundamentally flawed from multiple perspectives. The review would provide complete protection against any future allegations of bias or improper handling. "What about the construction quality assessment?" Sarah asked, referring to Rebecca's claims that the shed was poorly built and potentially unsafe. "Actually quite impressive," I replied. The foundation work exceeds code requirements. The anchoring system is rated for severe weather conditions, and the overall construction quality is notably high. Whoever built it really knew what they were doing. Sarah gave me a knowing look. I assume that would be you? Guilty as charged. 22 years of military maintenance work teaches you to build things properly the first time. It shows, Sarah said, examining the construction photographs I had included in my report. This is significantly better than most accessory structures we inspect. The complainant's suggestion that it represents substandard construction is completely unfounded. By mid-morning, Sarah had completed her supervisory review and prepared the final case disposition. The complaint would be officially closed with a finding of no violations, and Rebecca would receive formal notification by mail within 2 business days. The case file would be archived as a resolved matter with no further action required. 1 more thing to consider, Sarah said as we wrapped up the review. This complainant seems to have a pattern of strong opinions about neighborhood property standards. Has she filed complaints about other properties in the area? It was a perceptive question. Sarah was wondering whether Rebecca's campaign against my shed was an isolated incident or part of a broader pattern of harassment directed at various neighbors. If Rebecca had a history of filing frivolous complaints, that could affect how future reports from her would be handled. Not that I'm aware of, I replied. I know she's had disputes with other neighbors about property maintenance issues, but I don't think she's filed formal complaints before. This seems to be her first direct involvement with county enforcement. Let's hope it's also her last. Sarah said, "We don't need residents wasting county resources because they think they understand building codes better than they actually do." After leaving Sarah's office, I returned to my regular workload of scheduled inspections and follow-up visits. The morning was filled with routine cases, a deck addition that needed final approval, a fence height verification, and a complaint about an overgrown yard that turned out to be legitimate. Normal code enforcement work, free from the personal drama that had characterized the previous day. Around lunchtime, Janet called from the front desk to report another call from Rebecca Whitman. "She's asking about the timeline for receiving official notification about her complaint," Janet said. "Seems pretty anxious to know the results. Tell her the case has been reviewed and she'll receive official notification by mail within 2 business days," I instructed. Standard procedure for all complaint dispositions. Rebecca's continued calls to the county office suggested that she was still hoping for some sort of vindication, despite witnessing yesterday's inspection firsthand. Perhaps she believed that a supervisor's review might identify violations that I had missed or overlooked. Or maybe she was simply having trouble accepting that her weeks of research and preparation had been completely pointless. The afternoon brought a visit from Tom Bradley, a veteran inspector who had been with the county for over 20 years. Tom had heard about the unusual circumstances of my Maple Street case and stopped by to discuss the situation. "So I heard you had to inspect your own property yesterday," Tom said with obvious amusement. "That's got to be a first for this department." "Probably not the last time something like this will happen," I replied. People file complaints without realizing they're targeting county employees. It's bound to occur occasionally. What was the complainant's reaction when she realized who you were? Tom asked. "About what you'd expect." "Shock, embarrassment, then desperate attempts to salvage her position by demanding supervisory review." Tom laughed. "I've seen that pattern before. People get so invested in being right that they can't accept evidence to the contrary, even when it comes from the ultimate authority on the subject." We discussed the broader implications of the case, particularly the challenge of dealing with residents who conducted amateur research on building codes, and then assumed they understood complex regulations. Tom had encountered similar situations throughout his career, though none quite as dramatic as having a complainant threaten the very inspector who would handle their case. "The internet has made this worse," Tom observed. People can find code sections online and convince themselves they're experts without understanding the context or application. 20 years ago, most people wouldn't have attempted to interpret building codes on their own. Rebecca definitely put serious effort into her research, I acknowledged. She just didn't have the background to interpret what she was finding. Effort isn't the same as expertise, Tom said, echoing the point I had made to Rebecca during our inspection. But try explaining that to someone who's convinced they've discovered major violations. As the workday neared its end, I found myself thinking about how this incident would affect Rebecca's future relationship with county code enforcement. Her first experience with filing an official complaint had been a complete disaster, revealing her fundamental misunderstanding of the regulations she claimed to be enforcing. Would this embarrassing failure deter her from future involvement in neighborhood property issues, or would it motivate her to actually learn the codes properly? Before making accusations, the drive home took me through familiar suburban streets that looked exactly the same as they had the day before, despite the dramatic events that had unfolded. My neighborhood remained peaceful and quiet, with residents going about their evening routines, apparently unaware of the bureaucratic drama that had played out in their midst. The county truck in my driveway would no longer seem unusual to anyone who might notice it. Just another government vehicle belonging to a neighbor who worked for the county. As I pulled into my driveway and prepared to spend another quiet evening in my perfectly legal home, I couldn't help but wonder what Rebecca was thinking as she waited for official notification of her complaint's disposition. Tomorrow would bring the formal end to her enforcement campaign, delivered by certified mail from the very office she had visited so confidently just 2 days earlier. 2 days later, the official resolution arrived exactly as Sarah had promised. I was working in my home office that Thursday afternoon when I heard the distinctive sound of a mail truck stopping across the street. Through my window, I could see the postal worker walking up to Rebecca's front door with what appeared to be a certified letter requiring signature. This would be the formal notification from Riverside County Code Enforcement regarding the disposition of her complaint about my shed. Watched discreetly as Rebecca answered her door and signed for the envelope. Even from across the street, I could see her hands trembling slightly as she took the official county correspondence. She stood in her doorway for several long moments, staring at the envelope as if she could determine its contents without opening it. Finally, she stepped back inside and closed the door behind her. The certified letter contains Sarah's formal case closure report, written in the standard bureaucratic language that county offices used for all official communications. The notification would explain that the complaint had been thoroughly investigated by a qualified inspector, that all relevant building codes had been reviewed and applied, and that no violations had been found. The case was officially closed, with no further action required from any party. What the letter wouldn't convey was the complete irony of the situation, that Rebecca had filed a complaint with the very person she was complaining about. The county's standard notification format didn't include personal details about investigators or unusual circumstances. Rebecca would simply receive confirmation that her complaint had been dismissed after proper investigation. About an hour after the mail delivery, I noticed Rebecca's silver Honda backing out of her driveway. She drove away quickly, heading in the direction of the county offices. I suspected she was making another trip to demand an explanation for the case closure, perhaps hoping to speak with a supervisor who might provide different answers or identify errors in the investigation. If Rebecca did visit the county building that afternoon, she would have been directed to speak with Janet at the front desk. Janet would have explained, with practiced patience, that the case had been properly investigated by a qualified inspector and reviewed by a supervising official. The findings were final, and no appeals process existed for complaint dispositions, unless new evidence of actual violations could be presented. Sarah Martinez had anticipated this possibility and had prepared Janet for potential follow-up calls or visits from Rebecca. The standard response would be polite but firm. The investigation had been thorough, the findings were conclusive, and the case was closed. No amount of arguing or demanding to speak with higher authorities would change the fundamental fact that no code violations existed. Later that evening, I was working in my perfectly legal shed when I heard voices from Rebecca's backyard. Curious, I stepped outside and saw that she was hosting what appeared to be a crisis meeting with Margaret Kowalski and two other women I didn't recognize. They were standing near the fence line between our properties, gesturing toward my shed, and speaking in animated tones. I couldn't make out specific words, but the body language suggested that Rebecca was explaining the day's developments to her support network. Margaret appeared to be expressing sympathy and outrage, while the other women listened with expressions of disbelief. One of them was taking notes, as if they were planning some sort of response or appeal. The gathering continued for nearly an hour, with participants occasionally pointing at my shed and shaking their heads in apparent frustration. At one point, Margaret produced her own folder of papers, suggesting that she had been conducting additional research to support Rebecca's position. The entire scene reminded me of a war council planning their next strategic move, despite having already suffered complete defeat. Eventually, the meeting broke up with what appeared to be no clear resolution. Margaret and the other women departed, leaving Rebecca standing alone in her backyard, staring at my shed with an expression I couldn't quite read from that distance. She remained there for several minutes before finally going back inside her house. The next morning brought an unexpected development. I was leaving for work when Rebecca intercepted me in my driveway, approaching with what appeared to be a prepared speech and a more subdued demeanor than I had seen from her before. "Marcus, I received the county's letter yesterday," she began, her voice lacking its usual confident tone. "I still don't understand how this is possible. One researched those codes extensively, and I was certain about the violations." "I know you put significant effort into your research," I replied diplomatically. "Building codes can be confusing for people without specific training in their application." "But I had everything documented," Rebecca continued, pulling out a familiar manila folder. "The measurements, the code sections, the photographs. How can the county just dismiss all that evidence?" It was clear that Rebecca was still struggling to accept the reality of the situation. Despite receiving official notification that her complaint had been investigated and dismissed, she remained convinced that her research had identified genuine violations. The cognitive dissonance between her certainty and the county's findings was creating a mental conflict she couldn't resolve. "The county didn't dismiss your evidence," I explained. "They reviewed your measurements and found them to be accurate. The issue was interpreting which regulations applied to those measurements. You cited codes that govern different types of structures than the one you were measuring." Rebecca's face showed confusion rather than understanding. "But the codes I found were about building permits and setback requirements. How could they not apply to your shed?" This was the fundamental gap in Rebecca's knowledge that had caused the entire problem. She had found real code sections and real requirements, but she hadn't understood that different types of structures were governed by different regulatory frameworks. Her research had been thorough within its limited scope, but that scope had been incorrectly defined from the beginning. Detached accessory buildings without utilities fall under different sections of the code than habitable structures with permanent foundations, I explained. The permit requirements and setback rules you found apply to houses, garages with electrical service, and other primary structures. Simple storage sheds have their own set of regulations. I could see Rebecca processing this information, trying to understand how her weeks of research had missed such a fundamental distinction. Her confidence in her own expertise was being systematically dismantled by the realization that she had been operating with incomplete and incorrect assumptions. "So you're saying I was looking at the wrong parts of the code?" she asked quietly. "You were looking at parts of the code that seemed relevant, but didn't actually apply to the situation," I confirmed. "It's an understandable mistake, but it's Why the county employs trained professionals to interpret these regulations. Rebecca stood in my driveway for several more minutes, apparently trying to reconcile her self-image as a knowledgeable neighborhood advocate with the reality that she had fundamentally misunderstood the very codes she claimed to be enforcing. The conversation marked a significant shift in her approach, from defensive arguing to genuine confusion about where she had gone wrong. The weeks following the official case closure brought a noticeable transformation in Rebecca's behavior and her position within the neighborhood's social dynamics. The confident woman who had once measured property lines with mathematical precision and lectured neighbors about code compliance had retreated into an uncharacteristic period of quiet observation. Her daily surveillance activities ceased almost entirely, and the notebook that had once accompanied her on every neighborhood walk disappeared from view. Margaret Kowalski made several visits to Rebecca's house during this period, clearly attempting to provide moral support and perhaps strategize alternative approaches to the shed situation. I observed their meetings from my kitchen window, noting the increasingly frustrated gestures and heated discussions that seemed to accomplish nothing productive. Margaret appeared to be encouraging Rebecca to pursue additional complaints or appeal the county's decision, but Rebecca's enthusiasm for further confrontation had clearly diminished significantly. The most telling change was Rebecca's relationship with other neighbors, who had previously viewed her as a reliable source of information about property standards and neighborhood regulations. Mrs. Patterson from Oak Street, who had often consulted Rebecca about landscaping requirements, stopped making her regular visits. The Thompsons, who lived 2 houses down from Rebecca, began offering friendly waves to me during my evening walks, a marked contrast to their previous neutral acknowledgments. Word of Rebecca's spectacular miscalculation had apparently spread through the informal neighborhood communication network with the efficiency that characterizes suburban communities. The story was too perfect not to share. The self-appointed code enforcement expert who had threatened a county inspector with code enforcement action over a perfectly legal structure. The irony was so complete that it had achieved the status of neighborhood legend within just a few weeks. During one particularly memorable encounter, I overheard Mrs. Chun discussing the situation with her visiting daughter while they worked in the rose garden. "That poor woman spent weeks measuring Marcus's shed with a tape measure," Mrs. Chun explained in hushed tones. "She had no idea he builds those inspections for the county. Can you imagine the embarrassment when she found out?" The daughter's response was audible across the fence. "Oh my goodness. That's like calling the police on a police officer for parking violations." The comparison was apt, and it highlighted why Rebecca's mistake had resonated so strongly with neighbors who heard the story. Everyone could understand the basic concept of accidentally challenging an expert in their own field of expertise. The specific details made it even more compelling. Weeks of research, confident threats, and a dramatic revelation that completely reversed the power dynamic. Rebecca's retreat from neighborhood oversight activities created a noticeable vacuum in the local property standards enforcement ecosystem. Previously, residents had grown accustomed to her regular observations and occasional interventions regarding grass height, mailbox placement, and seasonal decorations. Her sudden absence from these activities was initially welcomed by neighbors, who had found her attention excessive, but some residents seemed genuinely uncertain about how to address minor property maintenance questions without her unofficial guidance. The Hendersons, who had returned from another RV trip to find their mailbox slightly askew, actually knocked on my door to ask about county regulations regarding mailbox placement standards. They explained that they would normally have asked Rebecca, but they hadn't seen her outside recently and weren't sure who else might know about such requirements. "Rebecca usually keeps track of these things for the neighborhood," Mr. Henderson explained, "but she's been keeping to herself lately. We heard something happened with a county inspection, but we don't really know the details." I provided the Hendersons with basic information about mailbox placement, guidelines while carefully avoiding any discussion of Rebecca's recent difficulties with code enforcement. The conversation highlighted how Rebecca's unofficial role as neighborhood standards coordinator had created dependencies that extended beyond her own property oversight activities. Another significant development was the apparent cooling of Rebecca's friendship with Margaret Kowalski. Margaret's visits became less frequent and shorter in duration, and their conversations appeared increasingly strained. I suspected that Margaret was frustrated with Rebecca's unwillingness to pursue additional challenges to the county's decision. While Rebecca had lost confidence in her ability to interpret building codes effectively, the breaking point in their relationship became visible during a particularly animated discussion in Rebecca's front yard. Margaret was gesturing emphatically toward my shed while Rebecca shook her head repeatedly, clearly refusing to engage in whatever strategy Margaret was proposing. The conversation ended with Margaret storming off to her car and driving away without the usual friendly farewell. Within my own household, the resolution of Rebecca's complaint had created an unexpected sense of validation for my approach to neighborhood relations. The careful attention I had paid to building codes and proper construction techniques had been vindicated in the most dramatic way possible. My preference for maintaining detailed documentation and following proper procedures had transformed what could have been a significant legal headache into a professional triumph. The shed itself had become something of a neighborhood landmark, though not in the way Rebecca had originally intended. Instead of being viewed as a code violation that demonstrated the need for stricter enforcement, it was now seen as an example of proper construction by someone who truly understood building requirements. Several neighbors had asked about my construction techniques and whether I might be available to consult on their own property improvement projects. Mr. Patel had been particularly interested in the foundation design, expressing plans to build his own storage structure and wanting to ensure compliance with all applicable regulations. After seeing what happened with Rebecca's complaint, he explained, "I want to make sure I understand the actual requirements before I start building anything." The educational aspect of the entire incident had extended beyond just Rebecca's learning experience. Other neighbors had gained a new appreciation for the complexity of building codes and the importance of consulting qualified professionals rather than attempting amateur interpretations of regulatory documents. The county's information office had actually received several calls from Millfield Creek residents requesting guidance on accessory structure requirements, suggesting that Rebecca's mistake had prompted broader interest in understanding actual regulations. Sarah Martinez had mentioned this trend during a recent staff meeting, noting that residential districts sometimes experienced waves of increased compliance inquiries following high-profile code enforcement cases. When residents see the consequences of misunderstanding regulations, they often become more proactive about seeking proper guidance. She had observed the long-term implications for Rebecca's position in the neighborhood remained unclear. Her expertise in property standards had been thoroughly discredited, but her underlying concerns about maintaining community appearance hadn't necessarily been invalidated. Some neighbors seemed to miss her unofficial oversight role, even if they had found her methods occasionally excessive. The question was whether Rebecca would eventually return to some form of neighborhood advocacy or would permanently retreat from property standards issues altogether. Her personality suggested that complete withdrawal was unlikely, but her confidence in challenging others about code compliance had been so thoroughly shattered that rebuilding any form of credible authority would require significant time and effort. Meanwhile, my perfectly legal, fully compliant shed continued to provide excellent storage space, while serving as a daily reminder of the importance of understanding regulations before attempting to enforce them. 3 months after the official case closure, Rebecca's attempted comeback began with what appeared to be a carefully orchestrated campaign to rebuild her credibility as a neighborhood authority figure. Her first move was surprisingly strategic. She enrolled in a continuing education course, on residential building codes offered by the local community college. The course was designed for homeowners and small contractors who needed basic familiarity with construction regulations, and Rebecca attended every session with the dedication of someone determined to never again be caught ignorant of building requirements. I learned about Rebecca's educational pursuits through Janet at the county office, who mentioned that several residents from my neighborhood had been calling to verify information they claimed to have learned in building code classes. One woman in particular keeps calling with very specific questions about accessory structure regulations, Janet reported with obvious amusement. She seems determined to become an expert on detached building requirements. Rebecca's renewed confidence became apparent during the 4th month when she began making carefully worded observations about various neighborhood properties. Unlike her previous approach of making definitive statements about violations, she now phrased her concerns as questions and suggestions. When Mrs. Patterson added a decorative fence extension, Rebecca approached her with, "I was wondering if you checked the height restrictions for that type of fencing? I've been learning about setback requirements in my building code class." The tentative nature of these interventions represented a dramatic shift from Rebecca's previous authoritative pronouncements. She was clearly trying to re-establish herself as a knowledgeable neighbor, while avoiding the confident overreach that had led to her spectacular failure with my shed. Her new approach acknowledged uncertainty and encouraged property owners to verify requirements independently rather than simply accepting her interpretations. However, Rebecca's educational efforts had an unintended consequence that became apparent during her first attempt to address what she believed was a legitimate code violation. The Martinez family, who lived 3 streets over, had constructed what appeared to be an oversized deck without visible permit notifications. Rebecca, armed with her newfound knowledge of permit requirements, decided this would be an appropriate test case for applying her enhanced understanding of building regulations. Rather than filing a county complaint immediately, Rebecca chose to approach the Martinez family directly with her concerns. This represented significant progress in her methodology, as she was now attempting the diplomatic resolution that she had never offered me during our conflict. However, her execution of this improved approach revealed that her educational efforts had created new problems alongside solving old ones. "I've been studying building codes at the community college," Rebecca explained to Maria Martinez during their front yard conversation, which I observed while walking my usual evening route. "I'm concerned that your deck might exceed the size limits for unpermitted construction. Have you checked section the 18th of December 045 regarding accessory structure requirements?" The problem with Rebecca's new approach was immediately apparent. She was now citing specific code sections with authority while still fundamentally misunderstanding their application. Her community college course had provided her with more detailed knowledge of building regulations, but it hadn't given her the practical experience necessary to determine which regulations applied to specific situations. She had learned to find the right code sections, but hadn't developed the expertise to interpret them correctly. Maria Martinez, who was an architect by profession, listened politely to Rebecca's concerns before gently explaining that residential decks fell under different regulatory categories than detached accessory structures. The code section Rebecca had cited didn't apply to attached deck construction, which was governed by an entirely different set of requirements that the Martinez family had properly researched before beginning their project. "I appreciate your concern," Maria said diplomatically, "but we obtained all necessary permits before starting construction. The permit notification was posted for the required period, and the deck meets all applicable structural and setback requirements for attached outdoor living spaces." Rebecca's face showed the familiar confusion that had characterized her reaction to learning about her mistakes with my shed. Despite months of educational effort, she had again misapplied building codes to a situation they didn't govern. Her improved methodology hadn't prevented her from making the same Fundamental error of assuming regulations applied universally across different types of construction. The Martinez incident became neighborhood discussion material within days. Though the response was more sympathetic than the reaction to Rebecca's original campaign against my shed. Neighbors recognized that she was genuinely trying to improve her understanding of building codes and had approached the situation more reasonably than her previous confrontational tactics. However, the incident also demonstrated that her basic problem, insufficient expertise to correctly interpret complex regulations, hadn't been resolved by community college coursework. The broader neighborhood response to Rebecca's continued involvement in property standards issues was mixed, but generally more tolerant than might have been expected. Some residents appreciated her genuine effort to learn about building codes properly, even if her application of that knowledge remained problematic. Others felt that her past mistakes had permanently disqualified her from any role in neighborhood property oversight. Mrs. Chen, whose opinion carried significant weight among longtime residents, offered perhaps the most balanced perspective during a conversation at the neighborhood mailbox cluster. "Rebecca means well, and she's obviously trying to learn from her mistakes," Mrs. Chen observed. "But maybe some people aren't cut out to be neighborhood code enforcers, no matter how much they study." This assessment captured the essential challenge facing Rebecca's rehabilitation efforts. Her personality seemed to require some form of authority or expertise that would distinguish her from ordinary neighbors, but her repeated mistakes with building code interpretation suggested that property standards enforcement wasn't an appropriate outlet for these needs. The community college course had given her more knowledge, but hadn't addressed the underlying issue of her tendency to apply partial understanding with excessive confidence. The situation reached an interesting resolution when Rebecca discovered a role that better matched her genuine strengths and interests. The Millfield Creek Homeowners Association, a voluntary organization that had existed informally for years, was seeking someone to coordinate their annual neighborhood cleanup event and manage communication about non-regulatory community issues like block parties and holiday decorations. Rebecca's organizational skills, attention to detail, and genuine concern for neighborhood appearance made her an excellent candidate for this position. The role allowed her to channel her desire for community involvement into activities that didn't require interpretation of complex regulations or enforcement authority. She could coordinate volunteer activities, manage event planning, and help neighbors connect with appropriate resources without needing to become an expert on building codes. The appointment seemed to satisfy Rebecca's need for community leadership, while avoiding the regulatory interpretation challenges that had caused her previous difficulties. Neighbors who had been skeptical of her code enforcement activities were much more supportive of her efforts to organize social events and coordinate maintenance activities that fell outside regulatory frameworks. Within weeks of assuming her new role, Rebecca had organized the most successful neighborhood cleanup event in recent memory and had begun publishing a monthly newsletter with information about community activities, county services, and seasonal maintenance reminders. 6 months later, I was working in my shed when I heard familiar voices outside. Rebecca was leading a group of new residents on an informal neighborhood tour, pointing out various properties and explaining community standards. When they reached my backyard fence, I heard her say something that made me smile. "And this is Marcus Thompson's storage shed," Rebecca announced to the group. "It's actually a perfect example of how to build an accessory structure properly. Marcus works for the County Code Enforcement Office, so he knows exactly what the regulations require. If you're planning any construction projects, he's a great resource for understanding the actual building codes." I stepped outside to acknowledge the group, and Rebecca gave me a genuine smile, the first truly friendly expression I'd seen from her since this whole situation began. "Marcus, I was just telling the Johnsons about proper permit requirements for their fence project. Could you point them toward the right county resources?" It was a complete transformation. Rebecca had found her niche as a community coordinator, rather than a code enforcer, and she was now directing people to actual experts instead of trying to be one herself. The neighborhood was more harmonious, new residents were getting accurate information, and Rebecca had found a way to contribute positively to community life. My perfectly legal shed continued to serve as an unexpected symbol of the importance of understanding regulations before attempting to enforce them. And Rebecca? She became the neighborhood's most effective advocate for consulting professionals, rather than relying on amateur interpretations of complex requirements. Sometimes, the best revenge really is living well and building to code. What's the most spectacular example of someone underestimating you that you've ever experienced? Drop your stories in the comments below, and if you enjoyed watching bureaucratic overconfidence meet its match, make sure to subscribe for more satisfying tales of justice served with a side of irony.